Welcome to Stoa Conversations. My name is Caleb Ontiveros.
And I'm Michael Tremblay.
And today we're going to be doing a movie review. So we had a listener reach out. Is anything wrong, or you just
No,
sitting
I was dancing in excitement for the movie review. We're
yeah.
back.
Just getting pumped. Yeah. So we're doing another one of our critically acclaimed movie reviews. In the past, we've reviewed 300, Gladiator. Maybe that's it. I feel like there's one other film that we reviewed as well.
This is number 3.
Yeah, so this is number 3 or 4. And we had a listener reach out and ask what our thoughts were about the new Seneca movie. And neither of us had seen it. So we just watched it. And that's what we'll talk about for this episode. It's a sort of modern depiction, a unique modern depiction of Seneca's life and death, really.
Yeah, let's jump into it.
Cool. So the movie, it's called Seneca on the Creation of Earthquakes. It stars John Malkovich, a great actor in my view. It also has Mary Louise Parker playing Agrippina, the mother of Nero. Directed by a fellow named Robert Schwenke. Sorry if I butchered your last name, Robert. I don't think I've seen any of his other films. Have you seen any of his other stuff, Michael?
No, I haven't.
Gotcha. Well, it's so this came out. It was released 2023. It's available for streaming on most of the major platforms, to my knowledge. And it's an interesting film. I think it's a kind of film that it's a little bit of an art house type film, and you'll either love it or hate it type film. And most people aren't too much of a fan of it. I think it's fair to say. Its Rotten Tomatoes ratings is at around 29%. IMDb is at 5 out of 10, and so on. So it doesn't have a maybe it's set up for having a little bit of a cult following or something like this, but it's certainly more of an art house type film, a personal film. And at least some people enjoyed it because whoever reached out to us mentioned they enjoyed some of the themes that it covers. And it does cover some of the challenges, I would say, Stoics, in particular Seneca, have always faced. And so sort of these broader themes about how to reconcile Stoicism in positions of power and how to respond to tyranny as a philosopher and as an artist, I would say. So regardless of sort of the merits of the film, it brings out a lot of important questions that we can discuss. So I'm excited to talk about it.
Yeah, it's definitely not. I mean, I think part of that low review is that when you think ancient Rome, you think Gladiator, you think this kind of epic historical movie, maybe some great fight scenes. This is not. We'll get into the plot, but this is not what this movie is. This is a lot of people talking to each other. I was reading some reviews about it, talking about how maybe it's more kind of like a play almost, and that's very conversational. Not really any set pieces other than people in rooms discussing philosophy and discussing kind of what's going on. And then I would think the other thing about it, I mean, we'll get into the plot, but I think it also doesn't idealize Seneca. It doesn't necessarily, depending on your reading of it, make Stoicism look very good. I enjoyed the fact that it took the philosophy seriously. Like, it's nice. It's great to get a 2-hour movie that engages with Stoicism, even if that's kind of critically, or the Seneca's character, even if that's critically. But I think maybe you're then alienating kind of two audiences. You got the kind of the historical epic audience that thinks that's not very epic, and then the Stoicism audience who goes, hey, you've kind of made Seneca look like not that great of a person. And maybe I think that might contribute to its low score as well.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, what were your overall impressions of the film? I think we'll start talking about our overall impressions and then jump into a play-by-play and pick out some of the main themes. But what were your overall impressions of the film?
I mean, I thought the film was really challenging. It portrays Seneca as a flawed person, as a person who comes up, approaches his death with a lot of fear, and then also possibly with a lot of conceit, attempting to die well as almost the performance, caring a lot about what people think about how he's going to die. And so on one hand, saying the Stoic things, acting in the Stoic ways, or at least repeating the Stoic lines. But I read the undertext as, not meaning those genuinely, not kind of talking the talk, but not walking the walk, or doing so in a very difficult way. Really struggling with the fact that he's been ordered to commit suicide by Nero, really caring about what that's going to mean for his legacy, almost wanting to live up to this ideal of Socrates, making that kind of appeal to other philosophers who have died well in the past, but also clearly being kind of doing this for shallow reasons, or at least partially shallow reasons. And so in that sense, I thought it was challenging, right? Like we like Stoicism on this podcast. I generally like Seneca's writing. And we talk about these people as role models, right? We do the contemplate the sage exercise, and you think, maybe I don't use Seneca as a sage that much for me, but I certainly use Epictetus and Marcus Aurelius, and you think about these kind of big three of Stoicism. And so to take one of these people and say, well, were they really that great? Did they really live up to the philosophy? It was challenging, and it left me thinking about, what it really means to put Stoicism into practice versus to put on the airs of being a philosopher, which is the fundamental question. I also found it at points boring, and at points maybe like long winded. So it wasn't like it was. I didn't think it was a 10 out of 10, but I do think it was challenging and made me think, which I appreciate about anything about something I've thought as much about as Stoicism. to come at it from a different angle was appreciated.
So overall, I felt like it was a film that was sort of, as I said earlier, kind of a love it or hate it film, and I almost loved it, but I wouldn't say I hated it. Of course, it's a little bit too far, but it didn't really land for me, with some exceptions. I think it does sort of. There's always this question about Seneca: was he a hypocrite? He's just a political player who put on Stoic philosophy as a performance, as a political play, and this film certainly takes that as fact. This film generally takes the more cynical reading of Seneca. It does make him seem a little bit more long-winded, and I think a part of that, the film itself seems to drag on. I also agree at parts it was boring, and it almost took too cynical of a framing of Seneca in a way that made it less challenging. I is perhaps one way to put it. Seneca almost becomes a caricature of a character, as do some other characters in this film, Nero, Agrippina, I think. But I found the depiction of one of Seneca's plays, Thyestes, particularly haunting and hard to watch in a way that I thought about it later, which is, I think, a mark of, if not a good piece of art, something that's worth watching. I did think about that later, and perhaps it's not how I would portray that play, but I felt like a legitimate piece within the movie as a whole. So there certainly were some positive things to say about it, and I think it's a good excuse to just talk about Seneca's life and the framing of it. So and anything that does that is fun to talk about.
Yeah, I also thought about it later, which is a good sign. Even if it wasn't not one of my favorites, it was a piece of art that I thought about later on. But yeah, let's get into the plot. We'll kind of frame it up and then jump into some themes from there.
Cool. So the general plot is, the short timeline is, it gives you a little bit of a taste of what Seneca's life was like at the court of Nero. He's trying to control Nero. He's trying to improve Nero's character, his rhetoric. Of course, it doesn't work. He gets thrown out of the court, and then Nero is sick of Seneca, who he sees as a pompous bastard, right? And orders him to kill himself. And he has this message delivered to Seneca. Basically, as Seneca's hanging out with all of his rich friends, he's just staged this play, Thyestes, that I mentioned. Seneca hears the news, and he has to come to terms with it with his friends, who are keen on leaving now that Seneca has been sentenced to death. They don't want to be affiliated with this man anymore. And one by one, Seneca's friends, so-called friends, slaves, leave him, and he dies alone, which is not at all like parts of it do fit in the historical narrative that we get from Tacitus. Seneca's death scene is almost over the top. He's ordered to commit suicide, and a variety of different methods don't work. So the film does that to display that accurately, but the you sort of get the picture from Tacitus that he's surrounded by his slaves, his friends, and dies a philosopher's death, even if it's full of perhaps a kind of dark comedy of these different methods failing. But in this film, Seneca dies alone. He's been alienated by his friends and servants. So that's a short play-by-play.
No, I think that's it. It's just a film about Seneca finding out he's going to die. He's been condemned to suicide, and then having to wrestle with that, and then kill himself. And so, it's the Stoic challenge of like dying well, or at least the Socratic challenge that came into Stoicism later. Is like this is there's this often theme in ancient Greek philosophy of like that's this real test of your philosophy. Philosophy, I think Socrates referred to dying, philosophy as a preparation for dying well. And so Seneca's faced with that challenge, and we get to see Seneca kind of blunder his way through it, really kind of over intellectualize and recite all of these Stoic teachings, but at the same time kind of act cowardly, like really be bitter and angry at the people that are leaving him, alienate the people that remain, have his wife commit suicide, the way the film portrays it, almost, out of selfishness. Like he doesn't want her to keep living. He wants to kind of be such a great teacher or such a great, husband that she's like, I can't live without you. Kind of wants her to die to kind of cement his legacy. And my understanding is the historical record, she does attempt to commit suicide. And then when Nero finds out, kind of stops her and has her wounds bandaged. And in this film, she just dies. It's kind of more cynical than that. He's trying to talk to Lucilius, and Lucilius slaps him in the face and is like, stop talking. Like, I've got it. I don't want to hear this anymore. And just kind of leaves him to die alone. It's really quite, so yeah, no, that's the story. But then it's like all these cynical steps along the way. Even that portrayal of the play, that you spoke to earlier, like in that scene, there's this moment where, is it a sacrifice, or what's the function? Two people are killed as part of the play.
Yeah, it's a story of Thyestes. So his Thyestes' children are killed.
Yeah. And so he has actual slaves, like actual humans killed as kind of like performance art, but they actually die. So there's just all these kind of terrible moments of, I think, ethical failure as he kind of navigates this last day of his life. Yeah, that's the play in the nutshell, is like the drama of that tension and that situation.
Yeah, so that's the play. That's the movie in a nutshell. I think it is accurate to, in some way, I think it is accurate to call it as a play. It does have that kind of feel. It's interesting that one intentional choice about the movie we haven't touched on yet is that there's a mix of modern and ancient. So Nero gets the term the president as opposed to the emperor. So there's certainly some sort of political readings one could have about the film from that kind of choice. I think.
Yeah.
Yeah, go ahead.
There's another scene where the rich people are watching Seneca's play, and one of them is like, "Oh, I hope he doesn't make this political." Like I'll watch whatever, just don't make it political. And then it kind of turns political, and they're like, "Oh," which I guess is probably tongue in cheek with this same kind of president reference here to Nero.
Yeah, absolutely. And you get a quick before you go to this scene of Seneca in his villa with his rich friends. You get some other cuts from the Seneca's life at court. There's Nero's decision to kill his wife Octavia, get a new wife. I think Mary basically his mistress. And then there's also this short scene of Nero killing his mother, which, I mean, both those episodes are, it's in this film sort of rendered as approximately correct. I do think Nero's mother, Agrippina, is very interesting, and maybe I think it could be given more of an interesting. I understand this film is not about her, but a very interesting figure, kind of figure who actually she wrote a biography that we lost. But she's a kind of character who schemed Nero, essentially schemed Nero into and killed Nero into his position in this movie, the position of president. Um, but it was clearly a pretty savvy political player, but I think comes off as a little less savvy in this movie, and Nero kills her directly. In the historical record, he had her assassinated. I don't think he killed her directly. And Seneca is, of course, in the movie there. Agrippina reaches out her hand for help, and Seneca turns the other way.
Mm-hmm.
He's complicit. I think that what this scene shows, he's complicit in Nero's ruthlessness, his desecration of the office, and when he does stand up against Nero, it's really just given. It's not with a firm backbone, right? He's tries to talk his way into Nero showing mercy in a specific scene, but shuts up as soon as he gets slapped. And I don't know. I felt like Agrippina got a short stick in addition to Seneca. I wish she could have gotten a little better treatment.
Yeah. I mean, nobody's portrayed particularly well. It's kind of like an equally, there's no real heroes in this one. And she's also the one that brought Seneca back from exile to tutor Nero. So involved in Seneca's position and Seneca's story as well.
Yeah, absolutely. So after those short scenes, then we go to Seneca's villa, where he's with a bunch of his rich friends, artsy type friends, perhaps fashionable people. They're dressed in a flamboyant manner, and he's shown Seneca's rendition of Thyestes. And Thyestes is a brutal play. It's about the house of Atreus, cursed house of Atreus, and the short version of this story is Thyestes is, like Seneca, called back to politics, called back to meet his brother Atreus. They have a blood feud of sorts because Thyestes was exiled, I believe, after committing adultery with Atreus's wife. And then Atreus, in a great act of revenge, has Thyestes' children killed and served to Thyestes as a meal. So it's a brutal play. Thyestes doesn't know, and then it's revealed. And it is an actual rendition. Seneca did write a version of Thyestes, their previous plays of this myth, of course. And it's probably one part of this film that's positive is it is probably the kind of thing that would have been shown in private. It's not a play to be shown in a large auditorium, but it is possible that the real historical Seneca had his plays put on by his servants or actors he knew in his own villas for the sake of his friends.
Yeah, it's a fun portrayal of how these plays would be shown and talked about. Not like the movie theaters today, but these kind of intimate performances.
Yeah, you have some funny comments. I like how there was a comment about, oh, Seneca's going to make this so over the top, which is a common complaint about Seneca's plays, that they're a spectacle, really. We covered Medea, and Seneca's plays are very ornate, violent, dark, and arguably have this political overtones as the film pulls out.
Mm-hmm. Which is just funny. It's funny to have. I mean, that's the kind of way Seneca is portrayed. He's portrayed over the top in his playwriting, and then over the top in his philosophizing. Right? Like instead of just like being straight to the point, or being like, "Oh, I'm afraid of death" or something, he's got to be like this, give this big dramatic Stoic line about how everybody will die eventually and how it's nothing to be feared other than like going back to sleep or something like this. And it's all kind of portrayed as being very dramatic, kind of like the play as well.
Yeah, absolutely. But as soon as he gets the announcement that he's, ordered to commit suicide, he tries to get out of it, is, the sense one gets, which, sort of punctures this image that he's not afraid of death.
He tries to get out of it, and then when he doesn't, he immediately shifts his perspective to like, okay, I've got to look the coolest. I've got to die well, which means preserving my legacy and really like putting on a show for the people that are still here. You know, making them see a follow up show, which is the death of me, just the same way, aspiring to the likes of Socrates.
Yeah, absolutely. You have his scribe taking notes, and he's like, "All right, I'm going to die, so I'm going to give a speech about some of the important doctrines of Stoicism and how I've lived up to them."
And I don't know
Uh,
if you caught it,
Essentially,
but
yeah,
the scribe is Lucilius.
yeah,
He
yeah,
calls him by name, which I thought was very funny. Which is the letters on ethics or the letters to Lucilius. Um, yeah,
yep, yeah, absolutely. And Lucilius also plays Thyestes in the play, so he has his servants performing these roles. Which, yeah, just to highlight, I did think that play particularly uncomfortable to watch. It's a difficult story. He does have two, Thyestes' children are slaves. They are killed in the play, which is difficult to see. The I'm not sure about the historical truth of that, but there are Christian writers. Tertullian writes about an episode where um, slaves would be killed in the Colosseum for public spectacle, perhaps as a part of plays or short stories, or maybe there's a little bit of a mythical interlude, and slaves would be killed then. So it wouldn't be totally out of the question, but it seems somewhat, given our actual record of Seneca, it does seem somewhat unlikely that would have in fact been what he would have done, especially since it does have a few words about treating slaves well. I think
Mhm.
that's probably a little bit too cynical about of a reading.
yeah, and a condemnation of the Colosseum. Seneca,
Yeah, yeah.
condemns that as well in his ethical writing.
There is a clear um, sort of space the slaves are given in the film that I thought was interesting and generally well done. There's this particular scene where some of Seneca's friends are leaving, and the camera highlights over the slaves that are going to carry the friends back home, and I think gives them a kind of space that shows how that separate they are from the concerns of these rich people. I thought that was well done. I don't know if you noticed that at all, but I thought like it showed how almost invisible they were to these rich Romans, and how little the rich Romans' concerns really matter to them.
Yeah, and I don't think any of them were ever spoken directly to. They're like carrying people around. They're like following through on their implicit instructions or orders, but they're not part of conversation or anything. Like they are these background pieces. But as you said, it's shot in a way that kind of draws attention to the fact that there are these humans that are these background pieces.
Mm-hmm.
It was definitely the saddest portrayal of Roman slavery that I've seen. Just because of that. Because I think often if you get Roman slaves, it's like even if they're dying in the Colosseum, there's like some sort of active agency, or they're fighting, or they're maybe a character in some regard. Here it was just like yeah, it was kind of tragic in that portrayal. This is a story about a uh, certain class of Romans, and the slaves are involved in that, but they're not part of the story, which is kind of this like, yeah, which I thought was I can't speak to the historical accuracy of that, but it was sad to see.
Yeah, yeah. So I thought that's something I think like one could say in favor of the film perhaps. Um, and another sort of challenging element, of course, when evaluating the Romans. Uh, so let's see, where do we want to go from here? We've got so Seneca receives the news. He starts going on in his bombastic way as John Malkovich, who does do generally a pretty good job, I think, of Seneca. Uh, he is, I think, a good person to play the character.
Hmm.
Um, and his friends end up leaving him. Seneca has a mark on him. He's politically risky to affiliate with. And Seneca has some sharp words for his friends who leave. He's like, you guys are, at least to one couple who leaves, he's like, yeah, all you guys care about is money. And they're like, well, Seneca, you became rich being the ghostwriter of a tyrant. What are you talking about? And he's like, oh, well, your relation to wealth is totally different from my relationship to wealth. I'm seeing it as a mere indifferent, and you all live for it and crave it and so on. And there is something to that as a criticism of these people. And it's interesting because it's clearly an accurate criticism of these people. But at the same time, you see Seneca just sort of as, you don't take him that seriously,
Yeah.
In the film. And you also see that someone's like, Seneca's is like, why are you getting so angry? And Seneca's like, oh, I'm not angry. I'm just, issuing my judgment over these people. So
Yeah.
that's a perfect Stoic retort. I'm not angry. I'm just,
No, she says, yeah, like, they don't deserve your wrath. And he's
right,
like,
right.
I judge, he says all these things he do, but I don't feel wrath. But while he's like seething with anger, right?
Yeah. Well, he's, livid that his friends are leaving. I found that's part, I think, where the film sort of became difficult to watch. He's just giving these long speeches. His friends are obviously leaving him, and he convinces his wife to die with him, to commit suicide with him, because that would be more beautiful, more of perhaps a way to model the life that Seneca once modeled. This is the way to end it. I die with my loving wife. That's how it's recorded for centuries. Just the sort of thing a Stoic shouldn't really care about. In Tacitus, it's written that Paulina, Seneca's wife, decides to die with him, but this film has the much more cynical reading, as we mentioned, that Paulina, sort of portrayed as a little bit of an airhead, an adulteress, is convinced to die with Seneca, and it's left unclear whether she does die or not. Eventually, two of Seneca's servants run off with her and try to prevent her from dying. So I think he's lost two servants at that point. All of his friends have left, and now he's just left with Lucilius, and this Roman who's been given the message that he's going to die, and if he doesn't commit suicide, the Roman soldier will kill him the next morning.
Yeah. And I mean, then we get to the end, right? Which is, I guess maybe let's just finish. Let's go through to the end because we're
Oh
close.
yeah, so we get Seneca's death scene, darkly comedic. Slits his wrists. That doesn't work. Tries to take hemlock. He has a fever dream, and he talks about the Stoic metaphysics, actually. So you get the sort of this cyclical nature of things, and then everything's going to die, perish, and fire. That part is actually pretty neat. And then he feels like he's going to die, and then of course he wakes up and he thinks like, oh, I dreamt of sweet meats, still not dead. So then he heats up a bath. Lucilius leaves him. That's a part where he's like, I'm tired of all your speeches. I think I have enough notes to preserve your legacy. Peace. Heats up a warm bath for himself. Is too afraid to get in. The Roman centurion pushes him, and he hits his head or something like that. And that's eventually how things end. So he doesn't die. He doesn't really meet his death with Stoic serenity. I think in the very end, he's trying to avoid stepping into this bath, and I think his last words were, "I'm scared. It hurts me." So the movie doesn't do much for Seneca's legacy in that respect, and that's how it ends.
Yeah, it's sad, or I don't know, pathetic.
Yeah, it's a bit pathetic.
And then there's a scene where they carry Seneca's body away, and the person is kind of driving his horse or riding his horse, and he's passing all these modern power lines. So again, there's like this, he's riding through like a modern power station with like electrical wires and stuff. So there's again that kind of interface between the Roman and the modern. And then the brief scene where Nero's death by suicide. later. So it's just like everybody meets this terrible end, this kind of really pathetic display of either cowardice or bad actions that lead to death. Um, yeah, I've got some thoughts on some themes.
Yeah, yeah. So let's pull out some themes.
So um, I think there's two main themes I took from this. It's not, it's not exactly Gladiator. We get this nice, kind of, I guess, moral or happy ending. Two themes I got from this. One is this question of hypocrisy, as you said. I think you can view Seneca as a hypocrite, somebody who like manipulates Stoicism for his own personal benefit and then fails to live up to the call of Stoicism when it matters. And then I think in that reading, the interesting question to me is like, how do we treat Seneca as if that reading is true and Seneca is a hypocrite? How do we treat his philosophy? And I think that the answer I came to was that there really needs to be this distinguishing between philosopher and then maybe like a teacher or a communicator. And I think even if Seneca is a hypocrite, basically you can separate the art from the artist. And philosophy is a craft. So in order to be a good philosopher, you need to be a good person. You can't be a good philosopher and a hypocrite. You can't be a
Mm-hmm.
good stoic and a coward and wrathful and in love with money. But you can still be somebody who's great at writing about stoicism. You can still be somebody that's good about talking about stoicism. So I don't think, even if Seneca is a hypocrite, I guess it doesn't have that many implications for the way that we engage with his writing. I think sometimes it's nice to have that kind of moral certitude of like, wow, Seneca's a role model of mine. He writes this really insightful stuff. He's such a great person. But I think it's okay if he was a hypocrite. I don't think that makes his writing any less valuable. Same thing if we discovered some sort of text that's, like, I really, admire Epictetus. We discovered some sort of text that Epictetus was a terrible person or something. I'm not sure how much that undermines the content of the communication. It undermines their quality as a philosopher. They were not a good Stoic by that criteria. But I still think even if Seneca was a hypocrite, his letters to Lucilius is a valuable resource, right? His writings are valuable Stoic resources. So the hypocrisy thing is an interesting thing to think about. I'm not sure if it has implications to how you should study him as somebody who has interesting things to say.
Yeah, it's an interesting question. I think there's sort of there are different ways to frame this, but one way to think about the question is, if you see, you can completely separate the philosophy from the philosophers, as it were, and just think about, I just want to evaluate the ideas on their merits and see, determine whether they're true or not. And if you're doing that, then you can still get value out of someone's writing, even if they fail to live up to their ideals, or even if they were a bad person. On the other hand, you kind of have this, view that, philosophy is biography, maybe a more Nietzsche type style view, and the philosophy says something about the person, or perhaps, and the art can't be separated from the artist, as it were. And you could have that view to more or less uh, strong intensities. Um, my view might be something like, perhaps the hypocrisy shows certain kinds of failure modes about a given philosophy, or temptations, risks to a philosophy that might be unique to it.
Hmm.
So there's not sufficient to write off the philosophy, but there is something to, say, critiques of Stoicism in particular that perhaps if you took this cynical reading of Seneca as the correct one, which I think we should have serious question marks about, but if this was completely correct, this would show that I think some critiques of Stoicism, framed as risks of Stoicism, maybe not reasons to write it off completely, would be correct in a sense. They would land. So, this idea that you can use Stoicism to justify the status quo, use it to work with a tyrant, perhaps, is a good one. Or perhaps something that's a little bit more challenging is this idea that Stoicism's impossible. And in a certain sense, Seneca must know that. So you sort of have this question, why is he
Hmm.
taking it on to begin with? It's probably for some other ulterior motive. If Stoicism, if you really can't say face death in the Stoic way, then it does seem like it becomes more of a performance. And perhaps I suppose that's just to me, I suppose that's probably the version of the, this criticism that maybe is the strongest, is that
Yeah.
Stoicism in its extreme form leads itself to a kind of performance because you can't actually meet that standard. So then what's the role the philosophy is playing for you?
Yeah, that's really interesting. My second theme, I'm going to come back to that, but
Okay.
the second theme I wanted to bring up was this idea that, yeah, what does it say about Stoicism itself versus Seneca the person? And I think what it says about Stoicism itself, on one way, you can read this as like kind of a mockery or a criticism of Stoicism, because here's this guy, he pretends to be a Stoic, and then, he just ends up being kind of a crappy person when he's faced with death. But then what I was thinking is, well, it's not really a criticism of Stoicism, because we don't admire Seneca. We think he's acting pathetically in a way. We think he's being embarrassing when he acts like this in the movie. We don't admire him. And the fact that we don't admire him shows the admirability of Stoicism. Like, how much would we admire the person that was actually able to do genuinely what Seneca's performing, able to
Mm-hmm.
actually confront death with courage, able actually to say goodbye to his friends without being angry with them. So Seneca's performing this, but it's not a criticism of Stoicism, because, yeah, performance is bad, but the genuine ability to do it is clearly good. That was going to be my second point. But your point is, well, the criticism comes not in the idealization of the sage. Obviously, the sage is beautiful, but it's almost like a pragmatic criticism of Stoicism, which is that it's either impossible to become the sage, so what's the point? Or you can get away with being pretty bad at Stoicism for a long time and pretending like you're not, because it ends up being quite permissive, or you're able to justify a lot of positions as being Stoic, as long as you're not caught being like emotionally dramatic in the moment, right? Like when
Mm-hmm.
Seneca's super angry, but he's like, oh, I'm not angry, I'm just judging. You can kind of pretend to be Stoic pretty well. Anyway, I think I'm just adding to what you're saying. I think that's a really interesting question. Maybe it works as a pragmatic, not a criticism of the end. Obviously, he would have been a really cool guy if he was able to pull it off, but pragmatic criticism of Stoicism in practice. It's like people can pretend to be it, or it's impossible even to become the goal. And so, what's the purpose of it?
Yeah, that's how I would see it. So I suppose if I were to draw out two themes myself, uh, taking a leaf from your book, as it were, one would be that quite maybe similar to what you just said, but one would be that you could sort of see this perhaps as and you could see this version of Seneca as an anti-model. Someone who's performing Stoicism, someone who's in the position of teaching Stoicism, and in fact, his teachings are good. They're valuable, but his failure to live up to the ideals in his life, or just ideals that would be common sense, make him a kind of render him a kind of anti-model. I think that's challenging, and I think always a good reminder. At least for me, or probably for you as well, as someone who is in the position of sharing Stoic ideas, to hold yourself to account. Um, so that's one key theme, certainly.
Yeah, I mean, you hit the nail on the head. When you said performance, that made it click for me, because there's a thing, he puts on the play, and then he goes and he tries to put on another play at home when he dies. It is really a criticism of Stoicism as performance. I think that's bang on, and I guess the nuance there is that that's easier to do the more power you have. If nobody's listening to you, if nobody takes you as an authority, there's not really much value to the performance. Like, okay, good for you, thumbs up. But the more power you have, the more easy it is to. And this would be the criticism of Seneca. When you're super rich, it's easy to pretend to be the kind of person that would do fine under pressure, but you don't really have that kind of pressure, or I don't know, you weasel your way out of your kind of ethical requirements. We see Seneca justifying everything he did as well. If I wasn't there, Nero would have been even worse. Yeah, I let him kill his mom. Yeah, I let him do all these things, but just because I was standing next to him made it 20, 30% better, and is that not the best thing you can do? And that's kind of seen as like it's portrayed as a bit of a weasel out of the requirements.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. That's a difficult issue, and I certainly one anyone thinking about Seneca's legacy should wrestle with. I think that is a there is this. I think the standard story about Nero's reign is that when Seneca, Agrippina, and another advisor, Burrus, were in power during Nero's earlier life, things went fairly well. But as Nero grew older, grew in power, things started going downhill a bit. And I think another theme that's related to this is you could sort of see the film as a criticism of art in general. You have, uh, especially political art. I think the work of this, the rendition of Thyestes in the film is a veiled criticism of Nero, but it's ultimately ineffectual. It's given to these rich friends of Seneca who do nothing about Nero's reign. It's put on by Seneca, who is one of the figures who could do something about the matter, but doesn't. And in the end, the work just results in two innocent slaves being killed. And I think that's, so I think that points to a kind of veiled criticism of a kind of political art, perhaps that's consumed by relatively well-off people, but is ultimately kind of ineffectual.
Well, is that theme just a similar kind of theme? Like, is that theme again just performance? Like this idea of except performance in the political space instead of the philosophical space? It is again just kind of like, yeah, saying the things you're supposed to say, but not going the extra step and following through. Like somebody with political power making a political statement instead of going and changing something with Nero. Um, maybe it's not that. Maybe it's not like a one for one because philosophy and politics are a bit different, but it's the same kind of thing about this gap between appearance and I don't know the real stuff. And that was one thing I was thinking about the movie because it's like I would hate to land on the cynical that like everybody is a hypocrite. Nobody follows through. Nobody really has there's no real model put in contrast to Seneca. There's nobody that really, if these people are the people performing, there's nobody that's really the model of being kind of genuine. Maybe the Roman soldier who's given
Yeah, I was going
orders
to
by
say
Nero.
he was probably the most genuine character. He's sort of the character who knows who he is, doesn't flinch from it. But who is he? He's someone who beats one of his soldiers to death because they're not physically fit enough, and then has no qualms about giving the death sentence to Seneca and dragging his body to a landfill at the end of the movie. So it's not exactly a inspiring figure.
Yeah, so it's just kind of a cynical message. We got a bunch of hypocrites, and the people that do know who they are kind of crappy.
Yeah. So, and it's always harder, I think, to make a positive. I mean, perhaps not always harder, but it does seem like these days, uh, it's harder to come up with a positive figure in these kinds of situations, these kinds of films.
I mean, but if you like, Russell Crowe and Gladiator, that's like an example of like, I know they're like entirely different genres, but like this is like I think about this in terms of you have the person who's like postmodern, self-aware, making a commentary on something versus the person who's just, it almost comes off in a way like anti-intellectual. If you're thinking too much about your philosophy, or maybe anti-academic. I don't know. If you're thinking about your philosophy, you're writing about it, you're talking about it, there's more likely to be performance versus just the going, the acting, the doing. And that's something that Stoicism talks about, something Epictetus talks about. But there's certainly a criticism of the talking about here, or questioning of the value of that. In Epictetus's words, I think Seneca's this portrayal of Seneca is vomiting up his stoicism all over everybody, instead of digesting it and turning it into something valuable.
Yeah, I think so. And in a way, there's something I was trying to say earlier. I think it's almost easier to show someone who does that than show the less cynical, more gray version, which is probably closer to the accurate version of Seneca, which is someone who does take Stoicism seriously, recognizes that he's someone, who's at the hospital with his readers, with his listeners, has serious flaws, and is in a difficult situation, and has serious political ambitions, has serious philosophical, in the best sense, ambitions, and is trying to make sense of those. I feel like that picture of Seneca is harder to portray and more interesting than purely seeing Seneca as a saint versus seeing him as this Machiavellian empty suit, as it were.
I think maybe that's a good idea to end on, which is like, if we're pursuing the truth of the matter, art is art. You can not saying this is not meant to be like a piece of, this is not meant to be like an academic classical portrayal of Seneca, but pursuing this, the truth of the matter, it's probably not going to be the saint. It's probably not going to be the cynical hypocrite. Both are caricatures or extremes. It's probably going to be that more complicated version, which puts you in a position where you can't write him off and you can't make him just this simple role model. And that's kind of sucks. You have to constantly wrestle with your opinion of him, but it's your opinion of Seneca, but it's more realistic.
Yeah, that's well put. I think that's a good spot to end.
Awesome. Thanks, Gil.
Awesome.
And thanks for the recommendation from our listener.
Oh yeah, thanks for sending in the rec. If you have any other films, works of art y'all would like us to review, just shoot us a message, stoa@stoameditation.com, and happy to do something like this again. Thanks for listening to Stoic Conversations. If you found this conversation useful, please give us a rating on Apple, Spotify, or whatever podcast platform you use, and share it with a friend. And I'd like to thank Michael Levy for graciously letting us use his music. Do check out his work at ancientlyre.com, and please get in touch with us at stoameditation.com if you ever have any feedback or questions. Until next time.